You're very welcome back to the programme now. It is generally accepted that the economy is beginning to emerge from recession, but it would be growing an awful lot more quickly if consumers were spending more. One important reason that they're not is the massive burden of debt that people are still carrying. Well, I'm joined now for more on this by James Treacy, who's the Chief Executive of StubbsGazette. James, thank you very much indeed for coming into us this morning. I mean, I suppose we've seen a huge amount of debt being processed over the last years, but it is personal debt that is the big issue at this point. What is the story with that?
Personal debt. Actually, personal debt, judgment debt has gone down by 30% so far this year.
What do you mean by judgment debt?
Judgment debt is when a creditor would sue a debtor for non-performance of debt. It goes to court and a judgment is granted. Now, what has happened over the last 5 years is an awful lot of that consumer debt, judgment debt, has not been paid off. So what's happening now, we're kind of coming to the final phase of the debt cycle, and that's the kind of resolution phase, and that will be done through the personal insolvency regime, the new personal insolvency regime, which has been in place since just before Christmas.
And is that regime, from what you can see from StubbsGazette's point of view, is it working? Is it delivering what it needs to?
It's been very slow to start. So far, there have only been about 800 applications processed through the Insolvency Service of Ireland. There have been about 200 protective certificates issued by the courts, and there's been about 200 successful plans put in place.
OK, let's just go through those figures there. So 800 have been processed, 200 protective certs. What is that? What does that mean?
A protective cert is when a personal insolvency practitioner meets with a debtor, and they're generally very, very stressful meetings, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
They typically last for about 2 hours, where the personal insolvency practitioner, which is a new profession, typically they be accountants or solicitors or financial advisors who have had to sit exams through the ISI and have been authorised by the ISI to conduct the personal insolvency arrangements. So they would sit down with the debtor, possibly for about 2 hours. And at this stage, the debtor will come in and they're under severe stress. They probably lost their job, lost their business, their marriage might have broken up. They're not sure how to put their next meal on the table for their kids. I mean, it's awful, awful stuff. But what we are seeing is we've actually set up a business with a personal insolvency practitioner called Mitchell O'Brien. He was the first authorised PIP in the country. And he's telling us stories. But the great thing is there is resolution for these debtors. So he sits down with them for 2 hours. He goes through, he does a fully in-depth examination of their financial circumstances. And in most cases, the debtors aren't aware that there is huge relief for them. So they might be living on maybe 150, 200 euros a month after they pay all their bills. But then when Mitchell explains to them that, just say, for example, if you're a married couple with a couple of kids, you are allowed under the new regime at least 2,500 of reasonable living expenses after your mortgage has been paid. So this is a huge relief for debtors. And when debtors leave those meetings, there's a huge burden taken off their shoulders.
And do you think debtors are getting to PIPs quickly enough? Are there a lot of people out there who should be a lot further on in the process?
There are. We estimate, we did a survey with Red C polls there last year on personal insolvency in Ireland, and the figures were shocking. I mean, there are at least 300,000 people who are insolvent in Ireland today. So if you look at 800 applications at this stage, it's just a drop in the ocean. But having said that, when the UK introduced a similar personal insolvency regime about 15 years ago, in the first year of operation, there were only 400 successful applications. So even in the first 6 months of the new regime, we are way ahead.
Did the UK scheme speed up quite quickly after that?
Yeah, in 2010 there were 120,000 personal insolvency arrangements. So our Red C poll with StubbsGazette, it has shown that when the regime gets up and running, which will probably be next year and definitely the year after, there will be 20,000 of these schemes approved every year.
And I mean, obviously you're coming from the point of view of the creditor here. Have creditors faced up to the reality as well of facing markdowns in the debt they're going to get out of people who are in this kind of situation? Well,
again, I'll just reference the UK. 98% of these plans are accepted are accepted by the creditors. At the moment, it looks like 74%, 75% of the plans are being accepted by creditors at meetings of creditors, which would indicate that
in Ireland here.
Yeah, so it would indicate that 25% are being vetoed. But the problem with the creditors vetoing these plans, especially the banks, is if they do veto it, it'll have to go back to the court, and the judge will have to make a determination. Okay, have you reasonably vetoed this? If not, I'm going to declare that debtor bankrupt. Creditors, that is not in the interest of debtors, and it's certainly not in the interest of creditors, because they'll get either a very little or nothing as a return.
And that 25% of creditors who are vetoing arrangements at the moment, is it mostly banks who are doing that? Do you know?
Mostly banks, but I'm not surprised. The banks would prefer to deal with these debts outside of a court arrangement. So they're just kind of kicking it down the road.
Just explain to me why they might prefer that.
Because they would prefer to deal with their debtors individually. They wouldn't. For the most part, they wouldn't like to have it a court approved, because then there are other creditors that also have to get paid off as well.
So the bank basically thinks that we can get more money out of these people if we're left to our own devices to handle them.
Exactly, they have more control. Whereas if it's a court-appointed scheme, they kind of lose that control.
And do you think that this, as the number of people going through the process speeds up, or has sped up in the UK at least, do you think creditors, it's a learning curve for them? Do you think that they will, more and more of them will accept the rulings here? Or is that something
yes, I think they will. I mean, because the reality is they will get a return. I mean, these plans typically last for 5 to 6 years of debtors paying into these plans and the money being dispersed to creditors. So they will get a return. They will have to accept write-downs. And so far we can see that the average write-down on a mortgage has been 20%, and the average write-down for unsecured debt, which would be credit card debt, credit union debt, is a whopping 89%.
89% on unsecured debt. So, I mean, the banks aren't doing too badly, a 20% write down on mortgages. So it's other creditors. Can I ask you, I mean, at the moment, it seems these personal insolvency practitioners, a lot of people are doing it. They're lawyers, they're solicitors, they're doing it as a sideline. Is that something that we need to change, that it needs to be more dedicated practitioners in this area?
Yeah, well, it's not sustainable. It's not really a bolt-on business. This is a full-time job. As I mentioned earlier on, the PIP, the initial meeting with the debtor, will last for 2 hours, and then it's a gathering of all the information. Then the PIP has to go to the ISI. They have to go to the court to get a protective certificate. This is even before PIP gets any fees. So there's a huge amount of work, and there's 140 authorised PIPs in the country at the moment. I would estimate that in a couple of years' time there will probably be about between 10 and 20 practising PIPs.
Really? So we're going to have a big surge of cases, and then it'll be done with?
Well, there will be some super PIPs that have the infrastructure. I mean, it's really the back office and the administration where the real hard work is done. And unless you have that kind of infrastructure, you won't be able to operate at volume.
And overall, James, I mean, looking at, you've highlighted certain issues there that we need to address, but do you think that finally we're beginning to see that the massive debt mountains we have in this country, that they will be processed? There is a light at the end of the tunnel.
There will be, and it's down to a combination of factors. The creditors are becoming more realistic. The debtors are seeing cases in the papers where there's been huge write-downs on their debt. As I mentioned, 90% in unsecured cases, 20% off their mortgage debt. And they get court protection. That's the most important thing. So it will increase.
It's getting more positive. Well, listen, James, thank you very much indeed for coming in to join us this morning. That's James Treacy, the Chief Executive of